So for this week on CyberSchool, we're going to talk about a common topic that we run into, and one of our most common questions that we get in our support department is, can I connect to this particular analog amplifier that I'm working with? And hopefully with today's session of CyberSchool, you'll be better able to understand it, or at least know how to address these kind of common things that you can run into. So when you're dealing with connecting to an analog amplifier, you want to kind of evaluate the options. First and foremost, the best place that I would recommend checking is our compatible to analog amplifiers page, where we list a whole bunch of different connection diagrams that are already pre-made for a huge variety of different amplifiers out there on the market. More than likely, we've probably already connected to that one or determined that we can't connect to that particular amplifier. So that's the first place that I would check if I were you, just because it's a really easy way to determine if we're compatible with it, and you get a diagram. But by chance, you might not see that on there, so you'll want to look at what type of inputs does the amplifier itself actually have. The common ones that you'll run into are standard tip and ring style connection, and that's identifiable with a regular screw down terminal, where you'll just see, a screw and you loosen it and you can jam a wire in there. That's basically your tip and ring style connection. You'll also see RJ11 style connectors on there. For us old kind of phone people, we know that means a regular phone cable, but for any millennials or any Zoomers that might be out there watching this, an RJ11 connector is what we used to use on old school analog phones. That's also known as a Cat3 cabling that you would use for that. The other common input that you'll run into on an amplifier is an RCA style connection. There are some other ones out there, but it's typically tip and ring, RJ11, or an RCA style connection. And then the next thing that you want to kind of understand is, okay, after you know what connection options the amplifier has, what CyberData device are you working with, or what CyberData device are you planning on working with? Because the paging adapter or the paging server are pretty much well suited to handle just about everything, but kind of niche products like our 4-port zone controller might not be able to connect to everything that, say, the paging adapter or the paging server could connect to. And then what if you had self-amplified speakers? What if you go out to a site and you're looking at everything and there's no big amplifier that you can connect to? They just got, basically a patch panel and some weird kind of gray box that's feeding into it. What do you do then? So if you go and you evaluate your options, that'll really help you plan and understand how you can connect between the two different devices, that analog paging system and whatever CyberData device you end up having. So the connecting to compatible analog amplifiers page, like I mentioned, is just a huge matrix of diagrams that we've created over the years. These are things that we're adding to frequently, sometimes a couple of weeks, sometimes, we maybe add one a week, sometimes there are weeks that we don't add any. But we're always adding to this page, and it's always expanding. I know since I've joined the company, probably about 5-6 years ago now, we've added, oh my gosh, probably 30 or 40 different connection diagrams on there. It's always expanding, and they're really easy to understand because we offer these different connection diagrams in a PDF format with easy colored lines between all of the different pinouts for what you're connecting to. If you need to take the positive connection, it's going to be either, a nice blue or a red, and then you've got your negative and your ground connection that are all going to be nice, easily defined colors that you can trace with your finger to the exact connection point on that particular amplifier. So it takes all of the guesswork out of something, especially if you print it in, say, grayscale or something like that. You'll still be able to understand and differentiate between the different colored lines. So it makes it really easy for installation. Plus, there's a little note section at the bottom that details any particular settings or jump switches or dip switches that you would need to adjust on the particular amplifier that you're connecting with. So it makes it really, really easy to go and connect to all these different amplifiers. But do be mindful of the CyberData product that you're going to be using for the particular connection, because some products have features that others don't. So you really want to make sure that you're getting the specific diagram for your specific CyberData product. Most of the time, you're fine, but there are some few instances where you'll want a specific diagram for, say, a paging adapter over the paging server in very rare circumstances. So as we move forward, let's talk a little bit more about the amplifier connection options. There's no real end-all, be-all option that we can say, oh, always just use an RCA connection, or oh, always use a tip and ring style connection, because every amplifier is going to be different. There's no, say, industry standard that an analog amplifier must have, X, Y, Z connection options. Some have some don't, and it really depends on the age of the unit. But newer options, this is one thing that we really seen going forward. Some of them tend to be modular, or you can get little cards that plug into the amplifier and you can connect whatever you want to it depending on that card, which makes it really easy to connect just about anything to these particular amplifiers. But on a general sense, most newer amplifiers just have more connection options because it's pretty easy for them to implement, and it makes it easier to sell these amplifiers into different areas. So they just come with a ton more connection options. But the four main ones that you'll run into are, of course, the tip and ring, RCA, and RJ11 style that we've covered before. But there's also the XLR style that you'll run into, and that's commonly used with different audio cables and condenser mics, a lot more audio style stuff. So things for, say, like churches or even schools can have some XLR inputs on there. We can connect to most of these different styles. There are some factors that you'll want to consider when you're actually connecting to one of these different amplifiers. But for the most part, we can connect to just about any kind of connection style on there. With that said, XLR is going to be the most complicated of these different connection styles just because of the nature of that particular connector. Frankly, the easiest way to go about making an XLR cable is to buy a regular, male-to-male XLR cable and cut the end off one side and check the different, check and find the tip, ring, and ground for each of the different pins and wire that up into the screw down terminal on your CyberData device. It's a little bit more complicated, but it'll work, and we've had plenty of people that'll do that out in the field. And RJ11 style connectors, your regular Cat3 style, your analog phone cables, those will typically require some kind of a custom cable, but those are much, much simpler than dealing with something like an XLR cable, just because of the way that those cables are built. You're not dealing with the actual shield and all the weird stuff that comes with cable manufacturing. When you're dealing with an RJ11 style connection, you just take a Cat3 cable, cut it, and you got 4 wires to deal with. So really easy connection style. So when you're dealing with actual connections, we've got our tip and ring or our RCA style connections. These are two, by far, I would say, the easiest style of connections that you can make that are both directly supported from our hardware with, little to no extra things you have to do. I would say objectively, the RCA style connection is absolutely the easiest style. You just take an RCA cable, you plug one end to us, and you plug one end into your amplifier. So that makes it, the easiest thing. You don't even need a screwdriver to work with. But we run into tip and ring a lot. This is probably, I would say, the most widely used, even though RCA is probably easier and cheaper for the manufacturers of the amps to actually implement. Tip and ring is just easy. It can connect with a lot of different stuff. It makes it really versatile for different products. CyberData and others alike out there, there's most of them just offer these regular outputs that just work from a regular screw down terminal. So they're really easy to connect with. And again, both of these are directly supported on our hardware with either our nice little green screw down terminal or our RCA output. And these are both going to be really typical options for even older amplifiers. We've run into some old Duquesne amplifiers that are literally older than I am that still have, at least the tip and ring style connection. I don't know if RCA was out way back then, but, the tip and ring connection worked back then, and it still works today. So, they're really well-versed, well-seasoned, good options for connection, and an awesome, easy way to go if your unit supports it. So next, then we get to the RJ11 or the XLR style connection. These are a little bit less common connection options, but you can run into them in some instances. The RJ11 is really honestly being phased out just because that was typically only included because it was paired with an analog phone system, and nobody does analog phone systems anymore. So the RJ11 is really being phased out. You really won't see that too much. But the XLR we're seeing is just becoming a little bit more common because multi-channel amplifiers that are typically used in more general audio usage, say like for a church or for a school gymnasium or an auditorium, things like that, where you've got a multi-channel sound system, people will be repurposing those amplifiers for use in a general paging system. They do the same thing, but we'll run into these different XLR style connections. And these become a little bit more common, but still, like I said on the last slide, our tip and ring or RCA style is definitely the market share out there. They're definitely the big ones out there. But between the two, RJ11 is absolutely easier than dealing with an XLR, just because of the nature of how the cable is built. the regular Cat3 cable, you've got 4 individual wires in there, 2 for your tip and ring, and then 2 that are used for the contact closure. It used to be for the loop start or the ground start voltage, but now it is really just used for contact closure, and you'll still run into that sometimes. A lot of the times when you're dealing with an RJ11 style connection, you can get away with just connecting 2 wires to our device. Sometimes you need all 4 for that relay contact closure, but it's much, much easier to deal with just because of the nature of how those Cat3 cables were actually built. And XLR kind of follows the same style. You basically just get a cable, you cut the end off one side, you probe the different wires that you find in there and try to determine which pin is which. It's a little bit more complicated just to deal with just because of the nature of how these cables themselves are actually built. Sometimes the ground is tied into the shield, or it is the shield that goes around the cable. So then you're kind of dealing with, grouping that all together and, making a real custom cable there. They don't look as pretty, but they can work. You can make them work out there, but not something that we run into too often just because XLR really deals with a high impedance a lot of the time. And that's one of the big pain points that you can run into when you're making these different connections, is that impedance mismatching. So now that we've kind of covered all of the different connection options out there, you really want to pick a particular style. And the biggest differentiation point, because CyberData devices can work with all 4 of those different connection styles, it depends on your amplifier. You got to make sure that both parties, the amplifier and the CyberData device, have a way to connect to each other. And the amplifier really kind of determines that, and we adapt to however that particular amplifier works. So one of the things that you want to look for when you're determining a connection point on the amplifier is checking the manual or maybe checking the silk screen on the unit itself to understand which of these different inputs, especially from multi-input amplifiers, have priority over the others. Back in the old days, you just used to get an amplifier that had one input and it just output that input. That's all it did. It just took a signal and amplified it and sent it off to speakers. But as things become more modern, and when I say modern, I mean like the 80s, they had more different connection options. So you really want to look at different options on there. Most commonly, and most convenient for us, most of the time the tel input on the different amplifiers is usually treated as the highest priority because it's supposed to be connected to your telephone system, telephone. So that's usually a good place to connect to, and conveniently that's usually a regular screw down terminal, your tip and ring style connection. So it makes it really easy to connect there. So that's really the first thing you want to be mindful of, is the priority level of that particular input. You don't want to say, oh, look, there's an aux input and I'm going to connect into that, and that thing's actually treated as the lowest priority. So then you could have your background music playing over your emergency fire drill or, some kind of terrible catastrophe that's going on, and you wouldn't hear it because somebody's playing, Mambo number 5 or something through your paging system. So you really want to be cognizant of those priority engines. But the next thing that you'll want to be understanding of is the impedance of the actual inputs on the amplifier and the impedance of the outputs of the CyberData device. Impedance, we've done a longer session on one of our CyberSchools that talks a lot more about this in detail. It's like almost an hour-long video, so if you really want to listen about that, we do have that kind of information out there. But generally, it's just the resistance to the flow of electricity, and you want to shoot for around a distance, ideally matching the output impedance of our device to the input impedance of whatever you're connecting to. But a difference of around 1,000 ohms or 1 kilo ohm is acceptable. It can add some audio quality issues depending on the wire that's used and the length of that particular wire, but we've generally find that a difference in either positive or negative 1,000 ohms or 1 kilo ohm really isn't discernible by most people. You really won't be able to tell much of a difference. The way that this will manifest in an impedance difference is if the impedance output of the CyberData device is higher than the impedance input of the amplifier, it can be a little bit louder. And the inverse, if our output impedance is lower than the input impedance of the amplifier, it can make it sound a little quieter. But around that, you've got about 1,000 in each direction, so 2,000 total. 1,000 above, 1,000 below, you're pretty much fine. You're probably not going to notice everything unless you're a real audiophile and you're trying to pump, really good quality music through it. But generally around plus or minus 1,000 ohms from our output is generally fine. So Self-amplified speakers are something that I mentioned at the start, but we really haven't talked about. They're honestly a really popular analog paging system just because they're really cost effective and very easy to install just because of the nature of how these particular speakers work. You don't have to go and deal with, an amp, specing the amplifier and checking the wattage requirements of the amplifier and how many you have, wired in series and all the stuff that comes with that fancy audio style design. You can basically just hook these things up, and most of the manufacturers of these, Valcom seems to be the real dominator, tells you, okay, this power supply is watted for so many speakers, and each speaker counts as one, and you can just connect that many speakers to that power supply, and they work. And it makes it really, really easy to install. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of actually speccing the right amplifier for the setup, which can be a lot more complicated. And sometimes more expensive. So we run into these quite a bit, especially with schools and some other general commercial style buildings will have these self-amplified speakers. The connection options are a little bit different as compared to, say, a regular amplifier, just because of the nature of how the circuits are designed with these and how the power system works, where the voltage is actually supplied in line with the actual audio signal. So if you were to say wire up one of our paging adapters or our paging servers directly to self-amplified speakers, it would work for a while. And then you'd notice, the audio quality might degrade, or you go and try to make an announcement, you don't hear anything, and you'll never hear anything again. And that's because of how the style works, and the wiring can actually backfeed current directly into our device. And when you're dealing with sensitive electronics, a negative, 70 volt signal, it doesn't really play nicely with really, really sensitive audio components. So it'll typically require some kind of an intermediary device in between the speakers and the actual audio inputs. There's one particular really nice Valcom box that they offer. It has this nice little volume dial on there that allows you to set the particular volume of the speakers, as well as isolating the connection between that fancy CyberData device that, costs you an arm and a leg and is providing that paging capability, and the rest of your speaker system. So you get a nice little clicky volume knob that helps you pick the right numbers, but they only go to 10. And you get that peace of mind of protection of that expensive CyberData product that you have on the other side. So when you're dealing with self-amplified speakers, you really want some kind of an intermediary device in between us and the actual speakers themselves. So is there a right answer to picking a connection option and actually connecting to an amplifier? Honestly, no. It really depends on the particular amplifier that you're working with. One thing to be mindful of is, of the different inputs that you have on this amplifier, the highest priority is always the best for your phone paging system, just because you're probably going to want your phone-based announcements to play over your background music or your radio or what have you. So that's just one of the biggest things that you want to consider as you're looking at these different connection options and different connection points on a particular amplifier. And one key thing, don't really worry about the connection style that you're going to be dealing with, because the audio quality is pretty much going to be consistent across the different styles. There are some differences when you're dealing with balanced versus unbalanced audio. Again, we got a much longer video that I'll link down in the description that you can watch about that if you really want to understand that, but there's plenty of other resources to understand the difference in audio quality that you can get with an unbalanced versus a balanced connection, but generally it's going to be about the same. But what I would really recommend is rely on our Connecting to Compatible Analog Amplifiers page for your connection diagrams. Let us do the work. We've been doing this for almost, almost 20 years. We've been doing this a long time at CyberData. We've got the expertise, and we can usually come out with a nice colored connection diagram for you within a couple hours, if not within the same day, depending on how busy our support team is or how engaged our sales team is. So if you're not sure about an amplifier, check it out on your own. But if you like, please feel free to send us whatever amplifier you're planning on connecting to, just a link to it or the name of it, and we should be able to come up with a connection diagram for it lickety split for you with those nice color diagrams. So let us help you make a diagram for your amp. So that way, when your field tech goes out there, he doesn't have to call you and then deal with your drawing on the back of a bar napkin or something that's all in pencil. We'll have nice color diagrams with any settings or dip switches that they might need to adjust, which makes it really, really easy for that installation and makes it a really seamless install for those end customers. So let us do the hard work for you. Just a couple terms that I would like to define as we went through. Some of these I didn't know. RJ11, it actually stands for registered jack. I had no idea. But that's basically just your common analog phone style connector. Really not used too much today anymore, but that's what that means. That's what that RJ stands for, registered jack. Then we get RCA, which is actually basically a proprietary connection option developed by the Radio Corporation of America, funny enough, and they just kind of appended their name to it. And it's a standardized option for both audio and visual connections. It's still widely used today, not as much anymore, but definitely when I was growing up, that's what you used for, connecting your Xbox or your PlayStation to your TV before the days of HDMI. You used an RCA component style connection. And then finally, we've got XLR, which I'm not sure what that actually means, but it was a connector created by Canon, the camera company, back in the 1950s, and is still widely used today. It's really kind of the industry solution when you're dealing with real analog systems for, say, concerts or church choirs or anything like that. They're pretty much all going to be using XLR style connections.
Thank you for watching this edition of CyberSchool. If you have any questions, please get in contact with our sales department. They are available by email at sales@cyberdata.net or by phone at 831-373-2601 extension 334. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe for more content like this from CyberData.